Perfect.
Beautiful. First, let me say welcome, everyone. To our second webinar. We did one last month. This one is really understanding an oil pattern program sheet. We get asked this question a lot. What do all these numbers mean? So my name is Gus Falgien. I'm Vice President of Sales for Kegel. Pleasure to have everyone with us, taking time out of their day. We know how busy your schedules are, so we certainly don't want to waste your time. Joining me today is Doug Dukes. Welcome. He is our, technical sales specialist, but obviously heavily involved in tournaments around the world. Does a lot of stuff, make sure machines and things are where they're supposed to be. Also, part of the charter or our core of the lane maintenance team. So welcome, Doug.
Thank you. Glad to be here. First one, and I hope one of many.
Absolutely. This is really kind of a series of webinars that we'll be doing. This one really, again, is about understanding an oil pattern program sheet. We have a program that's called Composite. Many of you have it that have our lane machines, but if you go to tournaments, World Bowling, USBC, a lot of these, you're going to see these program sheets pretty much posted everywhere.
Definitely. It's I know we just sent the program sheets out for the senior that's going on in Vienna. They'll be posting that tomorrow. And there's so many people that come to us and ask us exactly, what does this mean? What are the 2-2s? Where do you think we should play, etc. And while we're not going to get into too much of where we should play based on the sheet, we're going to try today to give you all the understanding of what those numbers mean so that you have an idea of where to start. At the end of the day, the program sheet is just a sheet. So when you're throwing balls down the lane, what that ball tells you is what you should really be listening to. But that program sheet gives you a very good idea of where to start.
Yeah, kind of, as we talk about, the fresh, if you will. Again, today the task is really giving you the numbers and understanding how to read that sheet, not necessarily ball motion or any of that. There's many variables that go into that at the end of the day. As we always say, the program sheet is a program sheet, but what's on the lane is the pattern. So, we're going to give you this information so you'll be able to understand, every bit of every number that's on there. Because a lot of time we'll just talk little bits, but really we're going to dive in, stay on task, and really show you how to read that entire program sheet today.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So here, obviously, you'll see what one of our standard program sheets looks like. This is a program sheet from a flex machine, which you'll see at most of the events that we do moving forward. But this sheet has a lot of information. So hopefully you guys are familiar with seeing this sheet, and hopefully today you'll have a better understanding of what everything means. As Gus said, at the end of the day, what goes on the lane is the actual pattern. And this is the program sheet. So you can't 100% base everything off the sheet, but it gives you a very good idea. I was talking with Gus earlier, and an event that I did a couple years ago, we tested a couple patterns during practice. Ended up, we actually tested one of the event patterns within a certain block. And we were a little worried that they were going to be too soft because they were striking at will. We released the pattern. Released the program sheet, and instead of relying on ball motion, everybody kind of looked at what was on the sheet, and this is where I have to play.
Assume that was
exactly. And it ended up definitely not being a high-scoring event. So I know that some of you have a really good understanding of what goes into this sheet and exactly what the numbers mean. And I know that some of you, when you look at a program sheet, this is kind of what you see. Where do I need to play? What do all these numbers mean? What angles do I want to play, etc.
Could be quite confusing.
No question. So basically what we're going to do is take the sheet from the top, go all the way through it, and kind of highlight all the key points and key numbers. So starting from the top, what you're going to see here initially is the oil pattern distance. Now, this isn't the distance of applied oil. This is a distance of the total buff.
Our total length of buff.
Exactly. Now, as you'll see on this pattern, it's 39 feet, which tends to be one of the I don't want to say toughest patterns, but most fair patterns for events.
That distance seems to match up with a lot of different styles.
Correct.
And or sometimes it's, it's short enough to be short, but still long enough to be long. So it really does, open up some different things at that distance.
The next thing that you'll see on the sheet is the reverse brush drop. So initially when our machines came out, if it was a 39-foot pattern, the brush dropped in at 39 feet on the reverse, no matter where your reverse oil started. So now we have the ability to drop the brush in wherever we want up until the point the reverse oil starts. This helps us control taper. It'll help us control transition. And typically, the closer we get toward the end of the pattern, I'll say the more difficult the pattern becomes from a ball motion standpoint. Along with that, we obviously have our oil per board. You'll see that this says multi-UL. So what that means is any machine that we came out with from the Ion Sports, the Walker Sport, and the Flex and Flex Walker, we're able to actually change the amount of oil that comes out of the tip per load stream. With all the machines prior to that, you would see that we'd have a 40 UL stream or a 45 or a 50 or whatever it may be, and it was locked in for the entire pattern. With the multi-UL, which is something you want to pay attention to, we are actually able, once again, to change those volumes as we go down the lane. And then we look at our forward oil total. So this is a total volume that's applied on the forward. It won't be to the end of the pattern. Let's say this pattern, for instance, it may only be to about 28 or 30 feet, which we'll see later on. And then it's buffed the rest of the distance. But typically what you saw in older patterns was a 50-50 split between your forward and your reverse. And if you look at the difference here between forward and reverse, we're about 16.7 to 9.9. So as technology has changed with different transfer systems and just different bowling balls and things like that, we're typically in the 60-40, 70-30 range now, forward versus reverse. Obviously, we have our total oil volume. So 26.6, 10 years ago, that would have been a flood. And now it's considered basically medium oil. Once you get over that 28 range or so, I'd say we kind of call it on the heavier side. So you will see some events that 28, 30, 32 mils, depending on the surface.
Oh, yeah. Upwards of that now. And really, when you're looking at this side of the program sheet, again, whether you're a bowler or really a layman, these two numbers alone are really what I tell most people they really pay attention to. Distance, obviously, again, and then volume. Because as a bowler, those two numbers are going to kind of help you decipher what equipment or what kind of surface you're going to use. So those are very important numbers, usually the first two that are looked at, when they're overall looking at the program sheet.
Definitely, no question. And then obviously we have below this our tank configuration. So this would be specific to a Flex machine. The Flex has the ability to run two different products if we desire. A lot of events that we're doing now, we are using two different products and we're putting them in different places depending on surface or what type of ball reaction we're actually looking for.
It definitely opens up some doors, like, kind of talked about in the previous webinar, gives us some ball motion and durability with different combinations of friction in a certain part of the lane. So knowing that or being able to see that on the program sheet is another one that definitely would help you understand what you're bowling on and kind of knowing that. So
definitely. And as we get a little bit farther in the presentation and start to talk about ratios, these products can definitely change how the ratios look.
Absolutely.
So the next thing that we'll look at is obviously the load structure itself. And we'll break it down, the forward loads versus the reverse loads. So if we look at the forward loads here, I'm going to go over exactly what all these numbers mean and where they come from. So first we have our start and stop, and you'll see an L number and an R number. And what we're looking at here, starting from the top, that would be two left to two right. So that'd be the two board on the left to the two board on the right. So essentially what happens is we have an oil head that travels across the lane machine, and there's a board counting prox that's basically attached to that head. And when the head goes from right to left, it'll start at two board. When it gets to the two board on the left, it'll shut off. It'll turn back on again. And when it gets to the two board on the right, it'll shut off. And for this particular pattern, it'll do that 5 times. Something that you want to look at, especially when you're bowling in tournaments, is if we shift the pattern or not. So as you can see in this one, to make play basically fair and equitable, depending on how many games they're bowling, what surface they're on, how many there are right versus left. You know, obviously we will tend to shift the pattern to make things equitable at the end of the day. Along with that, we have our loads, which I kind of touched on a little bit. So something that I look at, as well as, you know, the distance and the volume, is the number of loads, especially 2 to 2. So basically the distance and volume tell me what equipment I'm going to have and where I'm going to play. And the number of 2 to 2s kind of tells me how hard it's going to be. Yeah,
I mean, when you're looking at just that number, you know, the more 2 to 2s you have, the more you have, you know, kind of what we say on the corners. You know, you got oil outside, so the more you have out there, typically your angles are a little more parallel. You can't kind of go away at it a little bit more. But in context like this, you know, most of our average house patterns are, I hate to say 0 anymore, but, you know, within that, we'll say 1 to 2 range, you know, you kind of get into that challenge in 3 to 4. And then really when we start, you'll see some now, I mean, we're running, you know, 8, 9.
7, 8,
I mean, so that number is important because that really will tell you kind of, you know, what's happening on the corners as far as toughness.
Exactly. And then we follow that up, obviously, with our mic stream. So a standard mic stream on a lane machine when they go out the door for a lane machine that does not have variable mic is 50. Obviously, with the Flex machine, the Ion Sports, and things like that, we have the ability to change that mic stream going down the lane. And you'll see that here. So that really allows us to, you know, control taper or flatten the pattern out down lane. And we can really change ratios or change what we want with ball motion, not by changing a load and trying to figure out how to speed something up, slow something down to make up for it. We can just turn the pump up or down. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to that also when you look at a program sheet.
If you're a mechanic, lane man, tournament organizer, I mean, that is one area that really gives you a tool that you can really fine tune. But as a bowler, if you start to see those mic streams go down or up, you're looking at specific volume in that part of the lane where, you know, you'll explain that as we go through the sheet.
And I can tell you, I know you're probably the same way. Over the last 3 to 4 years, I don't know that I've done a pattern without variable mic in it for an event.
No, if I do, I wind up, you know, maybe adjusting the volume per that particular load or, you know, start and stop. So
the next thing that we have is obviously the speed, and speed becomes important. I feel like a lot of people see the speeds on the program sheet, but they're not sure exactly what they mean. So all of our lane machines have 6 speeds built into them. We have a 10, a 14, an 18, 22, 26, and 30 inches per second. So typically you'll see that we start out at a slower speed on the way forward, and we gradually increase speed as we get toward the back end. And then on the reverse, you'll see the complete opposite. The speed helps us really control taper as well. So if you think about the brush outside of variable buff, but it spins at a constant rate, let's say the 500 RPM, it's a certain number of brush strokes per square inch. And as I increase or decrease the speed, I can either go less brush strokes, which gets less in the front and a little bit farther down lane, or I can slow the machine down, which is going to put more in the front and less down lane. So it becomes very important when we're doing events and we want to control taper, how we control those speeds as well. And you'll see here, obviously, for the first 5 load screens of this one, we're running it all 14 inches per second. And then obviously we're changing speeds as we go down to start to change that taper on the back. Something else that you'll see along with the speeds, it's a number that's factored in as far as your load structures. We can't change the distances on that. But you'll see that we may do variable buff screens to control taper as well, such as we did here. You'll see that we have a 2-2-0 at 18 inches per second, another one at 22, and another one at 26.
It really helps you control that back part of the pattern.
Exactly.
And you'll know, because as you see these speeds speed up, you know we're tapering and we're thinning that part of it down. If you see it more of maybe that constant speed, that back part of the pattern is probably going to be a little flatter.
Exactly.
And you get a little more, again, down lane of that, transition or angles could become a little bit different. So understanding especially what that buff screen does, kind of stair steps that taper. And when you know that, you know, okay, I probably got maybe a little more miss at the
Right.
end or the exit point, if you will, at the back of the pattern.
Exactly. Take a look at the buffer screens. For any of our standard machines, the buffer is going to run at a constant rate. It's going to be 500 RPM for any battery operated machine. It's about 700 to 720 for an AC machine. The cool thing about the flexes are we have the upgrade and the ability to run multiple buff loads. So I can run the buffer at 700, 500, 200, or 100 RPM. So when you're looking at your program sheet, another thing obviously that you want to look at is what speeds the buffer is running at. So typically we'll run the buffer higher in the front to really peel oil off the brush and kind of create a launch pad, so to speak, and then slow it down as we go through the back of the pattern, and we may even slow it down more on the back end depending on what we're trying to do.
Yeah, if we're thinning out that back part of the pattern or trying to simulate maybe a little transition or carry down.
So as you'll see here, obviously, this pattern is going to be on the high buff screen for the first 10 feet. And then we're going to go out to what we would typically call our standard buff at 500 RPM or speed number 3, which will also be listed on your program sheet for the remainder of the pattern.
And that's important too, because if you're looking, again, if you're really focusing in on the amount of 2-2s and you're running a 4, you know that brush is spinning faster. So 5 might not be 5 right. in a normal setting. So understanding that you're using a higher RPM in those first 2 screens, you're going to know, well, maybe the corners aren't going to be as tight, if you will, or, you know, as much on the corners as you think.
Not as much Abraham.
No sandpaper.
All right, so then we're going to look at obviously our tank selection. This becomes very important on the flex as well, especially at an event where they may be using multiple chemicals. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you look at the program sheet and see what chemicals they're running and obviously where they place them. So we have a lot of ability with the flex machine. We could put, you know, one chemical on the forward, one on the reverse. We can actually choose what load they go in. So we do something called a launch pad where we would run one chemical for the 2-2s and then run a second chemical out to about 20 or 25 feet and switch back over. And all these things are something that you definitely want to pay attention to and look at because it's going to end up changing your ball motion at the end of the day. That particular pattern, obviously, we run all tank B on the forward. What we have circled here are 5 different things that aren't able to be controlled by us. These are all built into the lane machine and they're always pre-programmed. So we know, let's boards cross, for instance, a 2-2 is 37 boards. We multiply that by 5 loads and that gives us our 185 boards crossed. So when you're looking at the number of boards crossed, that's exactly how you would figure that out. As far as the start and end distances, once again, that's something that's programmed in. So we know that the head takes X amount of time to move from left to right. And we know that at 14 inches per second, for instance, in order for that machine to put out 5 loads, it's going to take 7.9 feet to actually apply it. From there, obviously, we have our total oil, which is done in the microliters. And if you were to divide that number by 1,000, it would give you the actual ml in the pattern. So 5 2-2s, for instance, at 50 mics is really 9.25 milliliters. And
these numbers are really ones that a lot of people don't look at. They don't really understand it. But from a operational standpoint, or the person programming it, and that, trying to understand how we come up with volume. The machine, basically, the more boards you cross, the more volume you're putting out. So when you see that breakdown, it's really about total number of boards crossed, which is in that program sheet too. So, you can kind of take a look at that as well, give you a good idea of overall volume, there. But a lot of people don't really necessarily look at that. But it's important because you can look at your 2s, 5s, 6s, but if you're not really understanding where that distance or what that conditioner is dropping in that part of the lane, you might get confused if all you're doing is simply looking at total volume.
Exactly. And the one final thing on this sheet that can be manipulated by us are those buff screens. So when we have that 0 load for the 2-2s, as you look at those last 3 screens, we can control where they start and stop. So you'll see, for instance, the first one, 2 to 2, 0, 18 inches per second. We stop that at 24 feet. And then we want to control that taper again. So we speed it up. We're going to go to 22 feet out to, or I'm sorry, 22 inches per second out to about 35 feet. And then finally at 26 inches per second out to 39 feet. So all those distances we can change. But when it comes to an actual applied load, that is all pre-programmed no matter what lane machine you're at, and it's all standardized across our board. Looking at the reverse, just a couple things that we'll point out here that are key. Obviously, we noticed the shift here in the pattern on the reverse, just a one board shift, left versus right. And the mics per board, obviously we're looking at 55 UL for the entire program on the way back. So we kind of manipulated a few things on the front and then kept it to a standard load stream on the reverse. And then the sneaky part about this is obviously tank A versus tank B. So for this particular pattern, you know, we ran fire on the forward, which was in tank B, and terrain on the reverse, which was in tank A. So you want to be very careful to pay attention, as we'll talk about a little later, what products are in the machine and what tanks are being used.
And that top number, that kind of zone, that first thing, 39 to 30 feet, where that reverse oil is starting can also change durability or, spark point through the mid lane. Because we have the ability to oil on the reverse. And that's really where we can control that part of the thing. So it's important, you match up drop brush with that. If you've got a real short reverse applied, maybe it's going to break down or that won't be as durable. So, paying attention to where those reverse loads start, are important as well.
No question. So then we'll take a look at probably the most looked at part of a program sheet, I would think.
Yep, definitely the
pictures.
overhead.
Yeah, exactly. So pictures say 1,000 words, and we'll take a look at what the overhead actually means. So a couple things that I look at for the overhead, obviously the number of applied 2 to 2s on the forward for this particular pattern. We're going to stop at about 8 feet. And then we're going to take a look at where the forward oil actually stops. So I know, really how much buff I have and where that's at. For this pattern, I want to say, and my eyes are getting bad too, but I think we're at about 22.5 feet.
Yeah.
For forward applied, and then buffing out to 39, which is what you see here with this line, the end buff distance. On the reverse side of things, as Gus said, something that we want to pay real close attention to is where that reverse oil, actually starts. Very important for saying how the pattern is going to break down or what it's going to be like going in 3, 4, 5 games in.
Yeah. I mean, that also can kind of help determine, a lot of people, will this pattern give me hold or will I have miss, area to the middle? Some of that reverse and where you're starting that has a big key play, in how much conditioner gets down lane. And the reason we do it on the reverse is because we want to keep that conditioner coming up. So if we're creating that hold by doing it in the reverse, if we did it forward, again, we might get too much at the end of the pattern.
Exactly.
So we're controlling that back zone, and then we're controlling that mid lane and a little bit of hold and durability on where that starts.
Probably one of the most underused graphs I think that we have on our program sheet is our composite graph. Basically how the composite graph works, if you were able to take a squeegee blade and pull all that oil from the end of the oil pattern and drag it all the way back to the foul line, this is how it's going to stack up on top of one another. And there's a lot of things that can be understood or pulled out of this graph, such as, if you take the rule of 31, for instance. On a 39-foot pattern, we subtract 31. Obviously, we're going to say that we're going to exit somewhere around 8. So for this particular pattern, if you look around the 8 board, on the composite graph, you're going to see it's a little higher to the left of it and a little lower to the right of it for a right-hander. That's kind of my sweet spot. Now, granted, once again, this is a program sheet, and what's out on the lane is the actual pattern and maybe a little different, but this is where you can get some good starting points. So looking at the forward side of thing, which is your lighter color, we can see that the forward's a little taller. We're about 70-30 on this pattern, 65-35. And then obviously looking at the reverse, how it stacks up on top of that, you'll see where we finish here.
Yeah, and if you're looking at just the volume again, and you look at the corners or doing that, how it stacks up on each board, you can pretty much know if you're above, 350 on the corners for a while and getting up at well over 400, the odds of you standing left and throwing it right, at big angles are probably not very good. So
Correct.
You tend to think you're going to be a little more parallel, a little more up and down the lane, or possibly using a little more surface.
No question. And obviously, we also want to go into the ratio side of things that's on the program sheet. As we look at the ratios, we're looking at the ratio difference between boards 3 and 7, and 18 and 18, and what the difference in those two sections of the lane are. That's what gives us our ratio. For this particular pattern, obviously on the left side, we're looking at about 2.26 to 1. And then on the right side, we're looking at about 2.21 to 1. Not a big difference. It's just that couple board shift that we have in the pattern.
You're in or out of that 3 to 7 area. You're gonna see that difference, in there. And really, when it comes to difficulty of patterns, again, it's kind of that sequence. I want to know distance and volume. Well, I want to know ratio, because typically the ratio, not always, but does kind of define a difficulty of a pattern.
Sure.
A low ratio pattern, you're flatter. You're not going to have a lot of help area by the load structure itself. The higher the ratios, typically the easier, the more margin of error the bowler creates. So, we're just really taking the snapshot from the corners to the middle and seeing what that looks like, and not always. I mean, we've had higher ratio patterns play way tougher than lower ratio patterns for various reasons, but it still is a pretty good indicator of the difficulty of a overall pattern that's unique to our program sheets.
No question. And this pattern, just as a nuance, we actually used this pattern last weekend at one of our events, and it worked out very well. I mean, it was a collegiate event, 5-man teams, 5 games. Nobody went over the caps. Everybody kind of stayed in the same place for almost all 5 games, which is really good. Now, granted, that played into the topography of the center, et cetera, et cetera. But we were really impressed with that medium volume pattern, and the distance that nobody really went dead left. And it was very fair and equitable as far as left to right, and skill level and what the gaps were in that level. So pretty neat to be able to take that pattern and put it on the lane and see what it actually does versus what's on that sheet as well.
And when we're talking about ratios, there have been some changes, to be aware of. Early on, we would, when sport bowling first came out, 2 to 1 was considered sport. Then went to 3 to 1. And then when we came out with, kind of our set navigation and then landmark and all that, when we defined the challenge pattern category in there, where people were not too hard, not too easy, but since then, USBC has defined the ratios a little bit different. So the ratio now, be aware, sport pattern is 4 to 1 or less, which means there's 4 times more, in the middle than the outside. Challenge now is in that 4 to 8 to 1. They've kind of raised it and, extended that, area. And then anything above 8 to 1 is considered a house pattern. Why this is important for people that are picking patterns or that is when those ratios kind of changed, there were some leagues that now fell into the challenge pattern category because they were running some of our landmark patterns that were 8 to 1, 7 to 1. At that time, we considered, kind of a house pattern.
Sure.
So all of a sudden, that league became a challenge pattern without them knowing it. So as a lane person or picking a pattern, you're the secretary of a league or win that, be careful what patterns you're picking and designing based upon the new, new guidelines, if you will, of the ratio rule.
Yeah, no question. You don't want to get caught on the wrong side of that one.
No, you don't want your bowlers being re-rated.
No, not at all.
Tends to be a bad thing.
So with that, one final thing is basically, in a nutshell, knowing the characteristics of your conditioner. We went over conditioners in the last webinar. So we're just going to lightly touch on some of the conditioners in our element series, and obviously what they'll do on the lanes and what you'll want to look for in your program sheet.
Well, why it's important, I mean, really, it could be from a lanesman point of view, looking at the program sheet, or a bowler's program sheet, or a pro shop. Because if you've got a program sheet, and typically, I'll let you kind of explain that graph, but if you will, a lot of times there's hookier conditioners and there's slicker conditioners. And all things being equal, pattern to pattern, if you're running an ice, they tend to get a little more wet dry. They tend to maybe push a little more and be a little slicker. If you're using a terrain, maybe it's a little more frictiony, a little more directionally in the pattern. So if I'm a pro shop person or a bowler, that's going to really kind of help me narrow down not only my equipment, but really surface.
Sure.
Because I'm probably not going to have a 500 grit, Aberlong sand if I'm bowling on all terrain.
Right.
Because I've already got friction built in, and I already know that friction is going to help kind of smooth out the wet dry transition. So I might go, more to that 2,000, 3,000, something like that, where I could see maybe ice, they drop down and get a little bit more. So understanding this can be a huge benefit, and having it on all the program sheets. Ultimately, of course, they got to put it in, or whoever's running the event shares that. But all the events we do around the world, we pretty much share that information so that you, especially if you're traveling to an event, you're not bringing, 30 bowling balls, or you're flying, it's a lot harder. So understanding characteristics of whatever conditioner you're using comes into play very much so on the program sheets.
No question. And I mean, obviously, fire and ice were the first two element series conditioners that we came out with, and they were kind of on the separate end of the spectrum. Ice being slicker and fire being a little bit more friction or hooky, if you will. And since we've added current and terrain, terrain being our newest one, but ice, like you said, it's going to be a little bit slicker. It can create a little wet dry depending on the pattern.
It's a little tricky in transition, quicker.
Exactly. With current being directly behind that, obviously current being a polymer-based product, it tends to be very durable, doesn't move around quite as much, tends to break down a little bit more evenly. And then we go to fire, which is kind of along the same lines as ice as far as what it does on the lane itself. Just
it similar properties.
Exactly. It just ends up hooking, a little bit more than what ice does. And then finally, backing up with terrain, this is our newest product. And this is going to be our hookiest or highest friction product, if you will. The cool thing about terrain is it tends to be very, very durable, even on high friction surfaces. So we tend to use one of these four products in probably 99% of the events that we do.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And looking at a program sheet, such as the one that we just discussed in the webinar, you got to be careful what you're looking at, because if you put a slicker conditioner in the forward and then you tend to put that higher friction in the reverse, that ratio of 2.6 or 2.26 may play more like 2.0 or 2.1, just because you put that friction in the middle. You don't quite have the hold that you had before. So you just want to be real careful, what you're looking at, and this chart's a great guide. Obviously, for what our conditioners do.
Yeah, I mean, understanding that A/B tank, kind of you're talking forward and reverse. Well, same thing. If I'm running maybe, like you just said, an ice on the outside loads, and then you've got some reverse loads that are narrower, and they're inside, and you're trying to play two parts of the pattern, you might, I'm playing on ice outside of 7, I'm playing friction in the middle. Again, choosing that ball or surface can be trickier depending on what you're doing. And if you're a lanes person, or you're trying to create, I love this pattern structure, it really fits lots of bowlers, but I want just something a little bit different. I can just simply mix and match, create more friction here or less friction there. But as a bowler, if you're just looking at it as a blanket, you might miss that. Or a pro shop, if you're trying to lay out balls for, yeah, I was going to say the Open Championships, but you don't know that anymore.
Right.
But in general, when you're going to these and you're laying out, equipment, it's important if you have access to these graphs again to look at them. And now, hopefully, if you're looking at them, you understand the numbers, what they mean. And now, again, it might not mean that I'm going to stand 10 and I'm playing 8, but it certainly should help you get to a starting point, and then also a good starting point of your surface, and to narrow down the amount of equipment you might need for that same pattern.
And it's very ironic because I know you were in my office earlier, and we're doing a pattern for an event overseas. It's coming up very shortly, and they were doing some testing and same pattern, and all they did was swap around some chemicals, and it was a totally different look. Running one chemical versus running a pair of chemicals versus running something else. So what the difference in those chemicals is, it can be major, it can be minor, but it could be major as well, is what that program sheet tells you.
Yeah, definitely. Each conditioner has a characteristic. Each ball, as much as you like, will roll differently. Sure. So, pay attention to the numbers, and hopefully now you can understand, what those numbers mean. And really, again, key points, I look at volume, distance, ratio, and then kind of my fourth would be that drop brush and how much transition I might or might not get. If you're looking at those 4 points as a whether you're building a pattern or whether you're bowling on a pattern, usually you can come up with the right combination of choices for your bowlers and or for your game.
No question.
Bowling on.
No question. So just want to thank you, obviously, for attending the webinar, and we'll take some questions now. And if you happen to see us in the field, I know that Gus does events, I do events. We have a lot of other people there, obviously, JJ and some other guys. So if you happen to see us and you want to ask us a question, we're always willing. So don't be afraid to approach us, ask us whatever you need. If it's something for the event, obviously, that we can't discuss, then we won't. But outside of that, it's all about getting you guys the information to make things better. And obviously, you'll see, our email address is here. And, if you want to scan the code that's on the screen for the next webinar that we're going to have.
Yeah, the next webinar, is really kind of, we've talked a little bit, in the previous ones of, again, conditioners and modern trends of overall lane maintenance and patterns, that type of stuff. Now we dove in and hopefully gave you the exact understanding of what those numbers mean and how to manipulate them to a certain degree. The next one, really, we're going to talk about the lane machine and adjustments and how to maintain it. Because at the end of the day, again, the program sheet's here, but if the machines are operating and they're not putting down the pattern the way the program sheet intends it to, you're not going to get the same results, which is why we get asked a lot, oh, I bowled on X pattern, that's not what we bowled on. Well, there's a lot of variables of what lane machine did or didn't do, which is why, it's a key that, we do events, all of our machines are matched, they come from here. We make sure that what that machine and program sheet are saying is what's on the lane for the integrity, at the end of the event. So the next one's going to be really cool to take this and then really make sure you are doing what you're doing for the mechanics that are out there and proprietors that are listening. So yeah, I think, again, thank you everyone. Hopefully you got some great information and understanding of our program sheets. And yeah, certainly let's take some questions, Doug.
Let's see what we got here. I'm going to shut the presentation down for just a little bit and open the chat up.
Yeah.
Let's see what we have. What will be the best way to break down lanes for a team's success?
Well, that's a loaded.
This is a very loaded question.
Depends on what exactly you're trying to achieve. We get asked a lot. You'll hear a lot today about pattern management, and going to an event as a team, probably no surprise. A lot of teams do it at the Open Championships and some of those, and they'll start in one part of the lane and maybe sacrifice some frames to kind of open it up to the right. That way there's something to move into the left. In a lot of cases, it really depends on the pattern now and what that back zone is. Because like we do a lot of patterns now with teams and that where we're already creating less transition in the pattern. So there's not really anything you need to break open or chisel away because you've got good ball motion on the fresh.
Exactly.
And then it's a matter of just getting lined up and then chasing the pattern, one direction, where sometimes you can get caught up in, chiseling out an area or everyone ganging up. And then you wind up cliffing a pattern and now you lose some of your other players because they can't get in the dry and they can't get in the wet. So you got to really be careful about how you're attacking these patterns and whether the pattern really needs to be opened up or attacked, so you have something or create something versus ball motion already being there on the fresh and just getting lined up and chasing it.
And I can tell you, just from this weekend, looking at the players, I mean, I watched some chalk come out of the bags. I mean, right in
snow
practice.
blowers.
Oh yeah, snow blowers. And they lasted about 2 or 3 shots in practice. And they went right back in the bag, and then they played them where they should play them, and they stayed that way the entire time. But I think it's also, like you said, more about having the same people in the same zone and being able to break that pattern down evenly would be the easiest way to explain that. Let's see, Michael. So it all depends on the type of machine used. Not necessarily. All of our battery operated machines, the buffer brush spins at the same RPM. You can have the same type of transfer system as far as the duo transfer system in that machine. And the Ion Sport, the Walker Sport, both the Flexes, they have the ability to do variable mic. There are some nuances with patterns that are specific to machines such as the Flex. Being able to run 2 different conditioners, being able to run variable buff, things like that. But all in all, in general, all of our machines are very versatile. So with that Ion Sport and above, being able to do variable mic, that makes it very important.
And, one thing we didn't really talk about, the program sheet, but typically the program sheet up in that far corner will designate the machine we're using for the event.
Exactly.
So Kazi has the ability, it knows when you designate that machine or you save that PDF. So like if you see a Flex logo, you've got the flexibilities in that sheet. So if you are trying to pull out a pattern and you have a different lane machine and see a Flex logo, a lot of times that might not exactly be, you can use it, but it's not going to have all those characteristics. So same thing, if you got an Icon logo, you have those abilities, and then you have an Ion Sport. So it's important you pay attention on their program sheets. Will kind of give you that information of what lane machine is being used in most cases and what abilities each machine can or cannot do. So if a center has, say, a new Icon Walker, but they have variable buff in the program sheet, again, it'll run that program, but those numbers don't apply because the machine doesn't have that function. So understanding that and the machine will tie into those program sheets.
And the one great thing about all of our machines is how it applies the oil as a standard. So no matter what happens, that 5 2-2s at 14 inches per second is going to be 7.9 feet, which can be the biggest variable in your pattern. So all of that across the board is standardized for all
pretty standard. Again, each lane machine has its own little, nuances or wear of the brush and some of that stuff. So, but in general, yes.
Let's see what this question is. Why do we do 60 UL with terrain on a custodian walker? Well, it depends on the program sheet and what the lane man exactly was trying to accomplish. Our machines will go up to 60 UL. They'll go down as low as 20 if you're using variable mic. So it's a possibility that sometimes we see people run a little bit higher volumes and run a little bit faster speeds, especially in larger centers. If they're trying to get things done a little faster, doesn't mean that it's not something that we don't recommend. So that could definitely be a point. Without really seeing the pattern, it's hard to explain why they did it.
I mean,
but
in general, most of the time, think of the mic stream as being resolution.
Right.
So if you're trying to really define a pattern shape, you might go with a lower mic stream because you're trying to get, more shape without getting over volumed. If you're really kind of going more of a, I don't want to say blockish type thing, but I want more volume and get the machine up and down the lane, I don't need resolution. Typically, that's where you'll see some of the higher mic streams. So it's really about the shape of what you're creating and what mic stream gives you the most resolution that you're trying to achieve.
Question from Rick. What is the purpose of reverse oil? There's a couple different reasons for it, obviously. One is to build in, hold in the pattern. So basically the forward is going to give us the integrity or where we're going to play.
Kind of that shape and exit point with distance.
And reverse is going to tell us, durability, hold, and some factors that go along there. So if you look at the pattern that we just brought up, obviously, 39 feet, reverse oil, I believe, started 30. Around 30. Mm-hmm. So that's going to tell us, about where we're going to play and how that ball is going to read off the end of the pattern.
Yeah, I mean, we've always said kind of, the two principles of lane conditioning, forwards that shape, exit point, if you will, and then reverse is depth, durability, hold, that type. Plus, again, as we talked about, there's a fine line if you're trying to get, volume through the mid lane and getting too much at the end of the pattern. And then you get transition or maybe excessive carry down. So by being able to create that nice forward taper and then, start that reverse oil and really build it back, gives us that shape and creates that durability to protect the mid lane without getting too much at the end of the pattern.
Sure. And being able to obviously add to that, with reverse buffer drop. And being able to help control that makes it even better. Let's see what else we have here. What do you mean with taper? So taper is basically how the oil lays on the lane and what it would look like on a 3D graph is the easiest way I can explain it. So the more taper we have, let's picture the graph being, a little bit taller at the foul line, and then it's going to taper down to the end of the pattern, which is going to allow the ball to transition a little better. And there's some other things that we look for with house patterns and things like that, where we typically run quite a bit of taper. And then when you're looking at, less taper, that's where we're going to run the machine more at constant speed. So you'll see a lot of 18 inches per second all the way through the pattern, and then, up to 22 or 26, in the buff screens. But taper nowadays is very, very important to how we control ball motion, carry down, and what the ball actually does off the end of the pattern. So if we're allowing that ball to store a lot of energy with less taper, it's really going to jump off the end of the pattern versus utilizing that drop brush or the differences in our variable buffer speeds to create more taper toward the end of the pattern.
Yeah, I mean, really, we're trying to create, when we say taper, it's really the, how steep the front to back becomes. And in a lot of cases, ball motion today in patterns really is about front to back. I like to say, you're controlling the taper, and that's where you're going to allow the ball, I like to say, do the right thing. But the ball either picks up too soon, doesn't come off with enough energy, or it doesn't pick up soon enough and comes off the back, balls going sideways off the back end. And as much as people want to see their ball hooked, that much on the back end, reality is it's not always the most consistent ball motion. So it becomes more tricky for your average bowler, where if you're creating a nice front to back taper, a little more archier, a little more predictable ball motion, it allows more of the people to understand what their ball is going to do. So, but it is a fine line of too much or not enough when you're doing taper. That's what's unique about our machines, is we can use these 6 different drive speeds to allow us to get that front to back taper perfectly where we want it in most cases.
Exactly. Nelson, let's see. With the naked eye, how would you know if the machine was streaking or dripping extra oil on the lane? Well, we like to obviously think that wouldn't happen, number one. But, there's really not a way to see that from the foul line moving forward unless it's, blatant. Typically, you may see that in ball motion or whatnot. But most of the events that we go to, obviously, we're using brand new machines, or we're tuning up the machines before we get there. So, you can be rest assured that if we're at an event, you're not going to see that happen. As far as what you may see, at your local events or things like that, it's very rare that you would see that happen, I think.
I mean, drips usually come from, excessive wear on your parts, machines out of adjustment. You have a hole or a leak somewhere, right, unfortunately. And a lot of times it might not even be conditioner. It might be cleaner.
Correct.
There were times in the old, if you had what we would call the old spray jet machines, you know, those check valves get tired, or, you know, you're really trying to put out a lot of cleaner, you would tend to get more drops of cleaner actually on the lane. But again, unless you're leaving puddles where the squeegee is not picking up anything and you're oiling over there, that's a different story. But a little drop here or there, in most cases, the ball never, you know, the ball wouldn't see that. Not that, you know, we want to see that, but sometimes a little bit of drip, you know, is not the end of the world, I would say. But yeah, I mean, we do what we call walk, you know, the lane. So every pair, every lane, we're walking front to back, we're walking the back ends. So if we were to say run across something like that and went, oh, it shouldn't look like that, we would redo those lanes.
Exactly.
Or at least make sure the machine, you know, something didn't happen, you know, on the other pairs. So
definitely. So that would be the easiest answer to the question, actually, you know, from the mechanic standpoint, walking lanes and watching your back ends. As Gus said, we walk usually every pair to every 4 lanes to make sure that everything's functioning properly. Not to say that a vacuum motor fuse hasn't blown or something like that, but we've always seen it before the bowler sees it. So hopefully you don't ever have to encounter that. Let's see. I'm also responsible for a sport league in our area. We're looking for patterns which hold up 4 to 5 games in a 4 respective 5-man team. Any recommendations on numbers I should pay attention to? Well, first off, you know, obviously it's going to depend on the type of machine, what surface you're bowling on, and what chemical the bowling center is using. But for this particular question, if you want to email me directly at my email that's on the screen, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about all the specifics for, you know, the bowling center, oil type, and lane machine, and we can definitely get you some patterns that'll work, you know, for your center for that league.
And one of the great resources we have is, you know, our pattern library or the pattern app, you know, where we have our, you know, the navigation 2.0s that, you know, sport or that are brought into the modern world. A lot of those were designed around today's balls and you know, volumes and that. So a lot of times that's a great resource, you know, to go to the, you know, the pattern library or the pattern app and look at, you know, all the new patterns we have. We post, you know, all the tournaments we do typically. So if you see something on social media that says, wow, that event was, this pattern was XYZ, and we had any involvement, you should be able to find that pattern on our pattern app and then download it. And, you know, again, if your machine's a little bit different than maybe what they use, the raw numbers that you saw today will go in the machine. It just might be a little bit different if you don't have the exact capabilities.
Sure. Donald, let's see. How would I design a pattern to help my students adjust to transition and to burn? That's another one. If you would like to email me directly, I actually have some burn patterns that we use here with some of our training at the training center. So I'd be more than happy to send you a couple of them, depending once again on lane surface and what type of machine you have. And then for your follow-up questions, if we have any plans to do similar webinar for understanding topography sheets.
Yes.
Yes.
The answer is yes. We're kind of going through a series of things. One of the things we're going to talk about, you know, is in the next one, again, machines, following up, you know, what it takes, you know, what is the lane environment, what is, you know, responsible, this or that. So yes, the answer is we will be following up with, you know, some additional topography. But getting through these, then we can tie everything into, you know, ultimately the playing field that is there. So good question.
Our buddy Mervin, will you need to make any changes to the machine to use terrain and fire? It's possible. So we have, and this will obviously be covered in our next webinar as well when it comes to machine maintenance and adjustments. But to touch on it very quickly, we have our pressure regulator tubing, and the longer that tubing is, typically the higher the pressure is, the shorter the tubing, that will decrease the pressure. So when you go into a product such as terrain that's a little bit higher viscosity or even fire, depending on what you were using previously, we'll need to cut that tubing a little bit shorter to decrease that pressure to a normal operating range.
And one thing to always remember when you're doing that is pressure doesn't correlate volume.
Correct.
So even though your pressure might go down or whatever, the pump itself, that FMI pump, is what's controlling your volume. So don't think if you lower that pressure, you're going to lose volume.
Let's see here. Larry, for someone who travels to tournaments with limited ability to carry large amounts of balls, wouldn't it be nice to have the pattern, distance, and volume available to pick what couple balls to take, especially with the new trend and adding speed bumps, etc.? Yes, it would be nice. However, at the end of the day, that's going to be up to the tournament management or the tournament director. Obviously, we provide all the assistance and lane machines, chemicals, things like that for events that we do. However, once again, at the end of the day, it would definitely be the choice of the tournament manager or director.
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, our events that we can control, especially whether it's a European tour, World Bowling, a lot of times, especially there, we'll announce at least the distance. So okay, if it's 40 feet,
right,
I'm not worried about bringing maybe too many urethanes, if you will, because you're not just going to all of a sudden show up at a tournament at 32 feet. So
sure.
We try to, and John Davis, our founder, he believed in, sharing this information and how important it was. So anytime we're involved, in most cases, we try to promote that, hey, if nothing else, let's give them distance and volume. And that should, as you're asking, give you enough to give you an idea of, what you need and what you would bring. So,
question from Mark. What exactly does fire on the forward, ice on the reverse do compared to just fire or just ice? Well, it's really the difference in those chemicals, as we explained earlier. If we're going to run, fire on the forward and ice on the reverse, typically we're going to have a little bit more hold in the middle. Ice is a slicker product than fire. So if you were to run, just fire together or fire by itself, you may lose a little bit of that hold in the middle.
A little bit of that free push, if we would, as we say.
Exactly. Versus running just ice as well, where, your corners may be a little bit harder. You might not have that recovery to the right like you would running a fire on the forward and an ice on the reverse. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds when you mix those chemicals.
And it's a durability thing too, because typically you like to think, ice is more durable because it's slicker. But at the same time, some of the slicker stuff, you're using more surface. So if you create friction in the pattern and give them durability with a slicker oil in the part of the lane, now you're really allowing that pattern to excel and be, hold up, much better. But if you're, all things being equal, apples to apples, in a lot of cases, your average pattern, you might see a 3 to 4 board difference between fire and ice in the overall, if you were everything being equal on the fresh. So it's just a matter of how that ball gets through the two different ones and where it picks up. So that's why we like the combinations of all of these, because it really does allow us to create different frictions in the right part of the lane.
Let's see what we have here. From Chris, Custodian Walker, terrain conditioner, first shift of league, about 120 average bowlers. Second shift, 200 average bowlers. Let's see. The bowlers, the shot burns out first game on the Pindex, heavy streaks of oils from balls, carry downs a little bit out of control, causing 8290 pin setter feeding problems. You can email me a picture of the shot. So that'd be great. To be honest with you, just off the bat from what you're saying, it sounds like we might have a little bit too much down lane, which obviously those balls, especially nowadays, are really going to snow plow that product, so to speak. Especially with those 120 average bowlers, because
they're using typically weaker cover stocks that aren't absorbing it. So they're doing that. And one of the things, back to kind of talking about taper, why we would taper is because when we talk transition, we want the pattern or the conditioner to transition inside the pattern.
Right.
So as you're depleting, you're also replenishing, and you're not getting all that excess oil, as you just said, plowed to the back part of the lane and actually create a, inverted lane, if you will. So that's where I think not having the right taper maybe and getting too flat down lane could be causing you those issues, especially with the lower average bowlers. And then you're plowing, and then you're bringing, your higher end players up, usually more aggressive. Their balls are hooking a little early. Now they're dying on the back. So you got a bad combination of the ball picking up too soon and seeing carry down.
Exactly.
So I think that could just simply be an adjustment, in some of your speed or what that front to back looks like.
So no question, Chris. Obviously, if you want to send that pattern to me, Doug.dukes@kegel.net, be more than happy to take a look and make some adjustments for you. I'm going to be busy while I'm in Vegas. Let's see what we have here.
Juan Fonseca. How you doing, Juan?
Running a Kegel design pattern using another machine from another company. How close will they be to each other?
We get asked a lot to, convert patterns, if you will. The technology is different. If you really go through and kind of what we did, back in the PBA league days where we were running both, we would run a lot of tapes every couple feet and really go back and forth to try to match up the two machines. But even that, again, the difference in chemicals from the companies, have different characteristics. So you're not always, they're just not going to match up.
No.
At the end of the day, that's just the reality of it. Good, bad, or indifferent doesn't matter. It's just, we can get them close as much as we try, but yeah, to try to make them be identical always is a little bit harder to do between the two different types of styles, and what they can do with their ability and what we can do with ours.
Sure. Nelson, I'm the president of a fun competitive league. Would it be more fun for the league bowlers if we requested the blue oil like we see on TV for the pros? It would help the bowlers read the lanes a little better. What are our thoughts on this? Our thoughts are, well, my personal thoughts are it's a great idea. Unfortunately, that is not available. That oil by itself, it's more of a dye type situation where it will get everywhere, on the lanes, in the pin setters, on the bowlers, on their bowling balls, etc. It's great for TV and it's great for what they do with the PBA, as far as being able to see the pattern and see what's out there. And if it wasn't quite so messy, I think it'd be great, for the bowling centers themselves. But unfortunately, it is messy, and it can be a mess inside the machine as well. So that's actually not available to the general public.
We've looked into, our chemists have looked into different ways of doing it or trying to create it. But as Doug said, it's pretty messy.
Yeah. Let's see. Thank you for the great info. This is from Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan. Can you explain what the load numbers mean? Didn't quite understand. So sure. The load numbers are how many times that head goes back and forth and how many times it applies a stream of oil to that particular set of boards. So for instance, in the pattern that we looked at, we had 5 2-2s. So as that machine goes as the head goes from 2 board left to 2 board right, it's going to apply oil from 2 left to 2 right. And then it's going to shut off and it's going to start again from 2 right to 2 left. And it's going to continue that back and forth until those 5 loads are complete. And every single pass is 1 load. So when you see that 5 2-2s, that's going to be 5 passes of the head back and forth, applying oil from 2 to 2 for each one of those loads. So I hope that helps clear that up for you. Trevor, is it possible to put up the graphs when explaining taper, hold, ratios, etc.? I do have some of those graphs. I don't know outside of what's in this presentation here, if we can actually put them up. I may be able to.
One of the things you can look at was if you, on this link, I believe, still has the first presentation I did. There are slides in there that
Okay.
will show you the taper and some of that, ratios and how we do some of that. So, yeah, if you go back, or I think we plan on putting that one's on as YouTube, well as this on our YouTube. If you go into that presentation, there are some slides that should kind of help you understand the speed and what the speed in that taper means to the pattern.
Perfect. What else do we have? Can a local or state association reach out to you to help them build an oil pattern for their local or state tournament? That's from our buddy Steve at Storm. Yes, actually they can. We do a lot of things. I can tell you that personally, I do a lot of things for, let's say, the New York State Bowling Association. I've done a lot of their Masters State tournament, even local events. We're doing the local Long Island Pro Shop Tour now. It's a service that we provide for free because we just love helping customers. So if you give us a call here at Kegel, we'll be more than happy to look at what lane machine they have, what product they're using, what surface they're on, and really help them design a pattern to kind of fit the parameters that they're looking for. We do for the 56 events that we're on site at. There's probably 100 more, 150 more that we actually do patterns for.
Easily. I mean, we do a lot here. I say here, but in Florida with the state proprietor associations, as well as the local associations for like city tournaments and that. So
exactly.
Yeah, we're always willing to help. All they have to do is call us, and we'll do our best.
Let's see, Mark, I've heard both answers about carry down. Does it really exist? And is there a typical mills or length that is more conducive for carry down? Yes, it exists. Oil is a liquid, and a liquid's going to move. So anybody that tells you that there's a product that doesn't carry down, I'd be a little hard pressed to see that one. However, there are different types of carry down, which becomes very important. So we have basically a higher friction carry down, which the balls typically don't see. The pin setters don't see, things like that. And then we have a carry down that, is a little bit slicker, which can in turn change ball motion a little bit. So once again, that depends on the product as well. You take a product like Terrain or Current, carry down is usually what we'll call minimal, and it's minimal in the fact that the ball doesn't see it, not minimal in the fact that it doesn't move as much. So it's very important to read up, and we have a lot of obviously white pages and things on our website as well outside of our webinars that can really help get very in depth on that subject.
And carry down will be conducive to again the equipment being thrown.
Sure.
I mean, if you're seeing a lot of spare balls go down the lane or urethane, those tend to plow and streak the carry down or that oil out of the back of the pattern, where higher flare bowling balls are doing it in little dash marks, so balls just don't see it. But yeah, carry down does exist. Usually though, again, when we talk about carry down and how to control it, it really, you start getting, sometimes, as we said, 30 mils.
Sure.
And you're putting the bulk of that, and you're applying to 35 feet on a 40-foot pattern, you're going to see some more of that, get pushed down the lane. So it really, I think there's not a certain volume. I think you can get carried down with any pattern if you don't have, your numbers dialed in and what equipment's being thrown.
Sure, no question. And I don't think it's a pattern distance really that does it. It's more about
I'm running a lot of, it's not uncommon to see, where I'm running 44-foot,
right,
patterns now for house patterns. And, 10 years ago, they would have thought I've lost my mind. But again,
sure,
I'm not applying 44 feet. I'm just creating longer buff with less to create more hold, but because of the way we do it, we're not getting the old school, oh man, I'm going to get carried down and all of that. So.
Sure. Shelby, you missed the live webinar. Is there any way we can view this later? Yes, no question. We will actually put a replay from Webinar Jam, which is a service we use to do the webinars. There will also be a link to a YouTube channel that will have a replay of all the webinars that we've done. So don't fret, you didn't miss it for good. Question from Chris. What's the minimum time needed for a fresh pattern to sit before bowling? That's another loaded question sometimes, depending on who you ask.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give you the long version of this one. Typically, we say, anything inside or outside of 15 minutes, you're good to go. Oil doesn't evaporate. So what we're looking for is certain products in the oil to kind of level out or smooth across the lane surface or wet it, so to speak. And then once that actually happens, you're good to go. We have a very interesting white page article actually on our website about this. And the cool thing about that article is, and to make short note of it, if you were to lay a pattern out today and you were in a setting where there was no dust in the air or anything like that, you could come in 10 years later with the same equipment and it would play just like the day you put it out. The big thing that happens for patterns that sit for a very long time, let's say overnight or something along those lines, is no matter how clean the bowling center is or what happens, there's going to be dust, particulates, and things like that in the air. They settle on the lane, and that creates friction, which then can change the characteristics of the pattern as you're bowling on it. But as far as how long it actually takes for an event, we usually say about 15 minutes. Let's see. What's an easy adjustment to prevent pattern from breaking down too soon? It's another.
I mean, there's many things that go into that, factor of breakdown. I mean, to me, the chemical you're using has an effect. I mean, ultimately, some are more durable than others. Total volume, what volume are you running for the style of players you have? You got high end or a high scratch league. Typically, you're going to be into that 24 plus mil range. Some of your senior leagues or maybe some of your lower end mixed leagues, you're going to be in the lower, end of that range. It's just really about trying to know what balls and what styles you have and then matching your volume, to your lane surface,
right.
As that. But to me, you can change certain chemicals sometimes and just get more durability from a different chemical. Again, not saying that chemical overall is going to be better, but it certainly might be more durable, than some of the other ones. So that's really one we would really, take a look at your pattern, kind of understand what, chemical you're using, and maybe the chemical is good, but you just don't have the pattern matched to the chemical. So,
and I think a lot of, those easy changes, sometimes, we get the customers that call in that it's lasting 2.5 games, and I just need to get it through that last 5 frames, etc. If they have a sport machine or a flex and they're able to do variable mic, that works out very well, because now I can just say that's fine in that zone where or that track area,
starting to see that burn
where you're seeing that burn, just up those mics. You may go from 45 to 50 or from 50 to 53 mics, and your problem solved very easily without having to change a lot of things.
Changes,
exactly. Yeah. So variable mic becomes a very good tool when it comes to that. Wow, I think that's it, Gus.
Well, again, for anyone that's left, we appreciate you taking time out of your day and look forward to seeing you on our next go-round.
Perfect. Thank you guys very much, and hopefully you can tune in for the next webinar on lane machine maintenance.
Absolutely. Have a great day.